Kafi from the philosophy department. Just past noon, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Carl Pearson. I'm the Associate Director at the Center for the Study of the Middle East. Welcome to the day 2 of our virtual grad student panels in preparation for the Middle East Studies Association meeting coming up in just over a week. The Center for the Study of the Middle East is a Title VI National Resource Center funded by the U.S. Department of Education, and we are grateful for their support for today's event and our activities in general. The way that's going to work today is we have 2 speakers, Alexander Shepard. Let's see if I can do this. I'm going to do something clever here. Alexander Shepard will go first with a talk entitled Theological Postulations of Usul Al Kafi, and Sayed Amir Asghari will follow with Intellect in the Shi'i Philosophical Theology. The way that we will run the question and answer session, because the crowd is small enough, is that all you have to do is raise your hand and we will call on you. You're welcome, if you prefer not to speak, to write your questions into the chat, and they will be relayed to the speakers. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Alexander Shepard. Take it away, Alex.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you all for coming out to our our assessment lecture today, and thank you to Carl Pearson for setting this up. My name, for those who might not know me, is Alexander Shepard, and I'm a PhD student in Middle Eastern languages and cultures, and I'm currently working towards a dissertation on political theology in Shi'i Islam. And this paper concerns some of the theological postulations and the philosophical arguments of the primary Shi'i hadith book, Usul Al Kafi, collected by the prominent scholar Al-Kulaini. The prominent Shia hadith book, Usul Al Kafi, contains many detailed philosophical speculations. In particular, it contains detailed philosophical elaborations on the nature of God as a hadith book, that is to say, a collection of sayings attributed to both the Prophet Muhammad as well as those considered to be his 12 successors, the 12 Imams in Shiite Islam, has many rich, detailed philosophical arguments on multiple issues such as the nature of God, the nature of the angels, the nature of the Quran, and free will, etc. And many of these hadiths specifically challenge and dispute Sunni theology. And the religion of Shia Islam was ultimately born out of a theological war with of dispute with Sunni Islam. One can deduce this from the hadiths, which are directed as philosophical polemics against the followers of Sunni schools of theology. In particular, one of the most profound differences in Sunni and Shi'i theology is in regards to the conception of God. Sunni hadith books portray God as occupying a place and being subjected by time. However, Shia hadith specifically set God outside of place and outside of time. And so the importance of this theological argument of Usul Al Kafi, and really the theologically polemical nature of it, is really done with kind of 2 objectives. The first objective is to emphasize the importances of stressing the differences between Sunni and Shiite Islam early in Islamic history. And this is contra the position that we sometimes get from some Western scholars of Islam, that in early years of Islamic history there was a unity or gradation between Sunni and Shiite Islam. And this is also done to challenge what I tempted to refer to as the myth or the theory of orthopraxy, which I'll explain now actually. Many Western scholars of Islam claim that sectarian differences are primarily legal differences, and that Muslims exalt law above theological postulations. According to this view, the mark of a heretic in Islam is deviancy from proper legal doctrine, According to this view, this was quite unlike the Christian world, which exalted proper questions concerning God, grace, and the afterlife. In contrast to a Christian orthodoxy, Muslim scholars valued an orthopraxy, exalting questions such as regarding the proper performance of prayer, fasting, and pilgrimage, above questions of God and his relation to the world. A sample of scholars who defend the theory of orthopraxy include John Walbridge, Daniel Pipes, and Bernard Lewis. For example, John Walbridge, in his book, God and Logic in Islam, argues that Islam is primarily a religion of law and that theological disputes are minute compared to disputes over legal disputes. Muslims, by and large, cared more about whether people practice, and this is quoting from his book, Muslims, by and large, cared more about whether people practice the laws of Islam than the nuances of their belief, end quote. Daniel Pipes, in his book, In the Path of God, Islam and Political Power, states that the political differences were at the core of the division between the various sects of Islam. He says that Islam has always primarily been a religion of law. Quote, Christians conflicted over theology and Muslims over power. Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestants differed initially over the best approach to God and then acquired the features of political movements, while the Sunni, Shi'i, and Khariji sects began by disputing the leadership of the Muslim community and only later acquired theological overtones. Bernard Lewis, groundbreaking and controversial scholar, is adamant in his book, Islam in the West, that Sunni Shiite differences do not constitute sectarian differences in the same sense that Protestant and Catholic divisions constitute conceptions of orthodoxy and heterodoxy in the world of Christianity. And this is the quote Bernard Lewis, quote, in earlier times, the divisions between Sunni and Shi'i and between the many groups among the Shi'i were not as rigid as they later became. They were never, even later, as rigid as the differences between Protestants and Catholics, or between the different Protestant churches in Christendom. And when seen from a Sunni point of view, even Shi'ism is not necessarily a religious aberration or a theological deviation. And then Bernard Lewis goes on to mention how there was a gradation in the levels between Sunni and Shia Islam throughout Islamic history, detailing how there were various Sunni jurists who were happy to consider Shia Islam as another school of law, in addition to the four accepted legal schools. However, brief study or overview of the contrasting views of the contrasting hadiths between Shia and Sunni hadith, reveal this is that this view of orthopraxy and this view of a Sunni Shia harmony is just simply not true. And just to give a little bit of the background of the life of Al-Kulaini, the compiler of Usul Al Kafi, he was active in the 2nd century of the Hijra during the lifetime of lesser occultation. That is to say, a flourishing period of Shiite intellectual scholarship between the immediate aftermath of the disappearance of the 12th Imam and the death of the 4th Bab or Gates, the representative of the 12th Imam. And it's also a period commonly referred to as the Islamic Golden Age. Al-Kulaini, he was alive after the lives of the 4 prominent scholars of Sunni Islam, Abu Hanifa, Ibn Hanbal, Imam Malik, and al-Shafi'i, and he was also roughly a generation after Imam Bukhari, the Sunni scholar who compiled the most authoritative book considered in Sunni Islam, Sahih Bukhari, and he actually lived at the same time Al-Kulaini did with Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari, the formulator of Ash'ari theology. Now, just to give a branch of some things which the Ash'aris believed and advocated is, roughly before the rise of the Sunni schools of law was popular opinion commonly referred to as the Mu'tazilite line of thinking. Mu'tazilite theologians generally denied the attributes of the God in the Quran, which seem to imply a physical limitation, such as God's hands or face or throne. The Mu'tazilite said, well, these were all figurative of God's power. God's beyond having a spatial or temporal limitation. And they also said that God's attributes, like his speech and his knowledge, his sight, his hearing, were all his attributes. His essence was his existence. Now, the Ash'ari school and the Sunni school, disputed this by taking either one of two approaches. Generally, Sunnis or the Ash'aris and the people such as Ibn Hanbal, they either said, well, we're going to just impose a gag rule over anything above the throne, and asking questions about God's hands or throne or face. We're just not gonna. You're not allowed to talk about it. Whereas others, such as Ibn Hanbal, took the idea that God sitting on the throne, God having hands, or God descending to the lowest heavens. These are all actually literal, and God is literally sitting on the throne because it says so. We have to believe it. Now, a common view, one which I think is probably more or less accurate as we get into the descriptions of God in Usul Al Kafi, that the Kulaini and the Hadith and Shiite Islam are done specifically to defend the Mu'tazilite position, from Ash'ari criticisms. And another key point of the Ash'ari school is that it often made a distinction between God and some of his attributes. And this is to quote from a prominent article on the Ash'aris. It says, quote, "The Ash'aris, for their part, affirm the existence of God of 7 or 8 eternal entities: knowledge, power, life, hearing, sight, will, word, i.e. substantives, by virtue of which God merits for all eternity the corresponding adjectives. It is true that such a doctrine implies a formal acceptance of a plurality of eternals, which is apparently contradictory to the principle of monotheism. Sunnis seek to avoid this difficulty by stating that these entities are at the same time neither identical to God nor other than him," end quote. And there's multiple hadiths in Sahih Bukhari, the main Shi'i book of hadith, which specifically designates God as something that can be seen. So there's hadiths which specifically say that just as you can see the moon and the sun on a clear night or day, you'll be able to see God on the day of judgment. However, there's multiple hadiths in Usul Al Kafi which specifically reject the idea that God is limited, and specifically reject the idea that God can have any kind of body or physical form, and multiple hadiths which specifically affirm that God is that God is identical to his attributes, contra the Ash'ari position of a separation between the two. And for example, one hadith in Usul Al Kafi says, quote, "Imaginations cannot comprehend him, and the timeless Sahar time does not reduce him, and time does not change him." The man asking questions then said, "Do you say that he hears and sees?" The Imam said, "He does hear and see. He sees without a hearing organ and sees without a means. He himself hears and he himself sees." By saying he hears without a hearing organ and sees without a means, he does hear, see, and he is all-knowing, and is the expert in all knowing without any multiplicity in his self or meaning, end quote. And another prominent hadith says, quote, "A rabbi came to the Imam Ali and asked, 'O Amir al-Mu'mineen, when did your Lord come into existence?' Imam Ali replied, 'Consider carefully the question when applies to one who did not exist and then came into being. When does not apply to the one who is eternal. He was before the before, without before, and after the after, without an after. He is not the end of some end, so that his end would also end.'" So it would appear here that Kulaini is responding to the Sunnis on two accounts. On one hand, he appears to be responding to the Ash'ari position that there's a multiplicity in God's essence. God's sight and knowledge is not distinct from his essence, and all of God's knowledge and all of God's seeing occurs with the oneness of God, and there's no multiplicity in God. And on the other hand, he was responding to the Sunni position of God being confined by time and space. He is removing the problems of God and his relationship to creation by making him transcendent from these. If God is not subjected by space or time, then he has always been qualified by these same attributes. And there is another hadith in Usul Al Kafi where Ali ibn Muhammad or Ali al-Reza clarifies the position regarding God's limited attributes in the case of body, shape, and speech. Ali al-Reza specifically denies that God has any kind of physical form or association with created beings in any way, shape, or form. What is most telling is that al-Reza states that even if someone believes in God and said that God is not like his creation, yet someone still has a belief that God has physical attributes, and is confined to space or time, then that person who believes in said thing, i.e., Sunnis or deviant extreme Shiites, are polytheists. And what's more is that this hadith in question specifically says that this idea, this polytheistic idea that God is a body, is a belief held by Sunnis or al-Amma, or commoners, as Sunnis are often referred to in Usul Al Kafi. And here's just a quote from the hadith directly. Quote, I wrote to Abu Hassan al-Reza alayhi salam and asked him about the belief in eyewitnessing Allah's self. Is it possible to see Allah's self with one's own eyes, as it is traditionally narrated in the affirmative by the Sunni Muslims al-Amma and the Shiite Muslims al-Khassa, who are contrary? And then the Imam goes on, and I'm ending the quote, and the Imam goes on to give a lengthy explanation of why that's not true. Now, just kind of to wrap this in, because I'm about out of time now, here we have a clear and irreconcilable differences between Sunni hadith and Shiite hadiths, at least on a literal level, is that in Sunni hadiths there is a it seems to imply that God is subject to shape and subject to time, where in Shia hadiths that idea is viewed as heresy and polytheism. And more than this, Shiites insist that God cannot be seen because that would be limiting God's body, limiting God's essence. Whereas Sunni hadith enemy states you will be able to see God on the day of judgment. So just to tie this all back in, and why this paper is important is this I think this kind of a sampling of hadiths which have been stated is done with the intentions of demonstrating that theology in early Islam and it was every bit as much of important in marking for orthodoxy as law was, and that so we really shouldn't consider Islam to be primarily a religion of law as opposed to Christianity being a religion of theology. We should acknowledge that theology is extremely important in Islamic sectarianism, and furthermore, is to show that that Sunni Shiite, at least by the 2nd century of the Hijra year, Sunni and Shiite differences were very clear and drawn in the sand, and these issues, and just kind of to and then of course many people will say, harkening back to what Daniel Pipe says, quote in the beginning, many people saying, well, all these differences between Sunni and Shiite Islam are really only confined to questions of leadership. It wasn't until much later we see other issues. At least here by the 2nd century of the Hijra year, here are profound differences between Shiite and Sunni Islam, which have nothing to do with questions of imamate or khilafate. And so that's another interesting point to show how important theological differences were by the 2nd century of the Hijra year, centuries and centuries before the rise of the Safavid dynasty. And on that note, I'll thank you, Carl, and I'll thank everyone for everyone here for everyone for listening. and I will, I guess, turn the mic over to Sayed Amir Hussein Asghari.
Thanks, Alex. Actually, I'm going to take the mic here for a moment. Would it be better if we had questions for Alex first and then go on to Sayed Amir, or should we do both and then turn to questions?
I'm fine either one. I'm happy to answer questions now if people want to ask questions.
Is that okay with you, Amir?
Yes, please.
Okay, so what I'm going to do, since we have a small enough group, is I'm going to change the settings so that everyone is allowed to unmute themselves. And if you have a question, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. I'll start if I may. John Chrysostom was a Christian father in the 4th century, and there's a famous quote by him that says, you know, you go to the market these days and everybody's talking about the divinity of Jesus and how to separate his manhood and his godhead, or what's the relationship between the 3 parts of the Trinity. These are conversations that are taking place, you know, at the bakery, right? As it were. So, you know, the way that I understand the Walbridge quote that you had early on was that theological questions are minor compared to the legal questions. So the question I have for you is, how do we evaluate the importance of these theological questions with respect to the legal questions? I mean, one way would be to just count, right? How many hadiths deal with what we might call legal issues, and how many do we count? How many deal with theological issues? And then we'll put them on a scale and we'll see what the balance is. There might be other ways. So how would you?
Well, I think another way, man, that's actually a really great question. And that would be interesting to count theological questions, to count hadith. I think, yeah, I bet, and that's, and I know somebody just guesstimating. I think that in definitely in Shiite Islam, if we're weighing the hadiths, at least in Usul Al Kafi, you know, I would say theology far outweighs the legal questions of hadith. I mean, maybe it'd be different for Sahih Bukhari or Sahih Muslim. But even in any event, though, I think another way of, you know, I guess approaching that would be to see how, you know, I know what was kind of the standard for declaring someone to be a heretic or an infidel in, you know, in medieval Islam, or even in contemporary Islam. Because now it's true that, like, you know, Hanbalis and Hanafis, you know, Hanafis and Shafi'is, even Hanafis and Shafi'is back in the day used to slaughter each other over how to properly place your hands when you pray, until they later worked out, said, okay, well, you know, all one school of law. But you know, it's equally true that, you know, there was tremendous, you know, persecutions of those who had, you know, deviant theologies. Like going back to Ibn Hanbal, you know, there's a very famous story that Ibn Hanbal, the founder of, you know, Sunni Aqidah, one of his main positions was that God, the Quran, is God's eternal uncreated speech. And the Quran's always existed just like God's always existed. And the Mu'tazilites, the aforementioned Mu'tazilites, you know, were adamant that, well, the Quran is created. God created the Quran. At one point, he gave it to the Prophet Muhammad. You know, that might be a semantic difference depending how you look at it, but in any event, that was one thing they used to rage about in medieval Islam. And there's a famous story that Ibn Hanbal was preaching that the Quran was eternal, and the Umayyads, who were Mu'tazilite, were flogging him and said, if you say the Quran's created, we'll grant you mercy. Ibn Hanbal responds by saying, well, if you say the Quran's eternal, God will grant you mercy. You know, so I think, and if we look at instances of history of when the Muslims denounced each other on legal issues versus theological issues, I'd be willing to I'd be willing to hedge my bets on theology as opposed to law. And we can look at even into the modern day, because, like, for example, like, I'm thinking of Mecca. even countries like Pakistan, they'll acknowledge, Saudi Arabia will even let Shiites, go make Hajj generally, and they'll let Shafi'i, because even though Saudi Arabia is dominantly Hanbal, is the Salafi form of Hanbalism, they'll let Hanafis and Shafi'is and Malikis all come make the Hajj, but they won't let Ahmadis make the Hajj, because Ahmadis, are a sect of Muslims who emerged in the late 19th century, who are, practically they're indistinguishable from Hanafis because they pray, they fast, and they follow Hanafi fiqh to the letter. But theologically, they believe in continuation of the prophethood after the Prophet Muhammad. And so I think those are some issues. I mean, I'm not sure does that answer your question?
Do we have other questions?
I guess I have one question.
All right.
So you said, Ahmed bin Hanbal and other Salafi, or say people of Hadith, believe that a literal understanding of God's hands, wajh, or istiwa, they believe in them. That you said, I guess. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, that's as far as I've understood.
So
I read from Hanbali literature, they will insist, well, God has a hand. We have to believe He has a hand, and God's hand.
This is my understanding. What they do is they don't like to reinterpret them. What their method is like this. For example, istiwa. So those are Quranic phrases. What we call right now ambiguous Quranic phrases. Say God's hand, God's wedge, face, or istiwa, sitting on the throne. So the problem, how we're going to understand these ambiguous, say, Quranic phrases, the stance of Ahmed bin Hanbal or people of Hadith, beginning with Imam bin Malik and Malik bin Anas, they don't like to make any kind of interpretations on those ambiguous Quranic phrases. Their motto is like this, especially beginning with Malik bin Anas, they say, Al-istiwa ma'lumun, means istiwa, sitting on throne, is known, it's there, but kayfiyatu majhulun means it is quality, its nature is unknown. That means we cannot know it, In that regard, our intellects are limited. We cannot know it. So this second part is legal, I can say, but it concerns theological issues. They say, al-su'alu anhu bid'ah. It means we cannot question them. We cannot try to explain them, because every single innovation, every single bid'ah is nar, a sin. Every innovator is going to nar, hell. So this is their understanding, this is their principle when it comes to ambiguous Quranic phrases. So in that regard, do you see any difference between understanding, believing in them literally, or avoiding making any kind of explanations?
Oh, I think, I'm glad you asked that question, because I think, because the Asharis, or many of them, I know you mentioned before that Malik ibn Anas has the famous quote saying that, and this is part of the Ashari Creed too, saying we're obligated to believe that God rose above the throne, but asking for it is innovation. And I asked about it is an innovation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is there a difference? I mean, I think there probably is a difference between openly promoting anthropomorphism, versus having a gag rule, because there are other Shia hadiths too. And of course, even beyond Shia hadiths, there's multiple, Shia theologians who said the same thing about avoiding, postulating on the nature of God's attributes. I mean, there's, I think, a whole section of Usul Al Kafi which says, avoid you getting into argumentation about, God's attributes. And Ibn Babuya, Sheikh Shaduk, one of the most important Shiite theologians, has, also says similar things. We'll keep your postulation below the throne, and also says that, he's talking specifically about qadar, about God's, predestination. He says it's a deep sea, don't enter it. But in any event, I think that, in terms, at least from the Shiite, position, when it's talking about, when it's making swipes and specifically saying that, well, the deviant Sunnis, or the deviant Shiites and the Sunnis have this view, Al-Khulaini, he could, I guess there's one of two options. He could either be, he could have considered, that position of avoiding asking about it to be bid'ah, to be a cop-out. I mean, that's possible. But it is also possible that, because, another issue, though, is that I think you can find, multiple Sunni sources who, would have that belief, specifically mentioned the last hadith I quoted in the paper, that people like, Yusuf Estes or Bilal, I'm talking about contemporary scholars, like Yusuf Estes, and Bilal Phillips, or modern Salafis in general, like bin Baz or Ibn Uthman or Albani, will generally insist that, oh yeah, God is a body. And, Salafis, at least what I've read, Salafis I've talked to, they love to quote a hadith where it says that, every midnight of, I think, like every I forget which day of the week it is, but the midnight of every week, God literally comes down to the lowest heaven to take a closer look at the believers. And I've read Salafi thinkers and seen Salafi videos and talked face-to-face with Salafis who will quote the hadith when, they say why they disagree with someone like Ibn Arabi or Imam Ghazali, both who, rejected literalism. So I guess, does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Very interesting stuff. In the interest of time, though, let us turn to our second speaker, Syed Amir Asghar.